Welcome back to the class, everyone. GAC is my favorite game mode and one of the more important upgrades that you can make for your characters to do better and get better rewards is Omicrons. And while a lot of them can turn some losses into wins, not all of them are created equal. So that really is the point of today's video. Is we're going to go through and take a look and rank all of the GAC Omicrons that currently exist. I'm going to try to be a little bit quicker with the ones that have been here for a long time. And if you do want to go back and see a more in-depth touch on them, I'm going to go ahead and link my last video on this or of this type in the description below. That being said, we're going to do this a little differently than usual. I want to rank the triple GAC Omicron characters first, and then we'll move on to the single GAC Omicron characters later. Number one, it's a little bit cleaner to do instead of having the character appear 3 different places and kind of having to explain which Omicron is which. And on top of that, these characters are all just on a higher caliber than the other ones collectively, so it makes sense to do this. So first up, I want to talk about the 2 characters that really benefit from having not just one GAC Omicron, but 2. And that is going to be Bensil and Malicos himself. Bensil is very simple. The Forest Dyad is the most important for him, as it creates this really terrible game for your opponent to play where he's constantly reviving. Some counters can handle this really well, like Starkiller, whereas some counters like JML will really struggle to get through Ray if JML keeps repeating his turns over and over again because he's so fast and the enemy just keeps coming back to life. The other one that is not as crucial but very important and can cut out some counters, or at least weaken some prominent counters, is going to be the 4-turn healing immunity. I've had it happen to my Starkiller before, where he doesn't take enough turns and then I end up eating a Whirlwind and a Ultimate, not even back to back, but within Starkiller's 4 turns of each other, and it ends up killing him, which isn't overall great. I've also had it happen to my Jolie, who then died during Ray's Ultimate and couldn't revive everyone. Again, it's not really a hard stop to all those counters out there, but you're adding one more element that's making some really reliable counters against Ray that much less likely to win. Malicos is a very new character, so we do want to spend a little bit more time on him, but his most important Omicron is going to be Strength is Power. And while we were right about this being important and the first one you should apply when he first came out, there's more to it than we originally thought. When he first came out, I just saw this bottom line here that says whenever any other unaligned force user ally uses a special, he assists. Not only is this great because he's a good damage dealer and he will have repost, so he'll be hitting below protection because he's attacking out of turn, but one of the lines I really underestimated that is a big deal is that everyone is going to get locked crit hit immunity for 2 turns. Not only does this really curb bounty hunters even as a 2-shot, because Mando cannot gain turn meter, rather he can't even give turn meter to this entire team when you're trying to get contract hitting in the very beginning, and really you're only giving the Malicos team more turn meter because you're constantly hitting them and they'll eventually run over you. But on top of that, one of the more fringe counters right now for the Seer Malicos team is General Skywalker himself. And one of the great things about General Skywalker is when he goes first, he will use his AoE, he will crit the entire enemy team, and they will have to dig themselves out of that hole, because when General Skywalker crits them, he also increases all of their cooldowns. If you have this Omicron, where he gives everyone crit hit immunity for 2 turns, General Skywalker doesn't get to do that, and you get to go right out the gate hitting them as hard as you can, knocking General Skywalker down, and you're really letting the enemy have to rely on good RNG like a 5 sacrifice and some right timing with the form up to be able to then beat it. So overall, amazing Omicron. You definitely want it if you have Malicos in any effect. The second one, I do still really like this one. I don't think it's as important as I did when he first came out, and the reasons why is the ability is good, everything that it does is good. It's just not very relevant. So enemies defeated by allies can't be revived. This didn't turn out to be that big of a deal because Malicos himself is the one who's killing everyone. Both his AoE as well as his basic and his special do a lot of damage, and he already nullifies revives. So this, what was going to be a little bit niche, really is just completely irrelevant because he's the one doing most of the slaughtering on the team. The other thing that's just not that big of a deal is he has a savior mechanic built in here too, and the reason why that's not very relevant is because you kill Malicos first. When you're going up against this team, he is the biggest threat. Whether you have an ignore taunt like Jedi Knight Revan, or with bounty hunters, you can use that, or you can just dispel crew because he's not that sticky of a taunter, even though he's still pretty good, and go around and get him. So really, I mean, you're still getting some nice things in here, and maybe you are isolating a few of those counters by having this, but ultimately most of what he has is through Strength is Power. Echo the Fallen Order is pretty decent. His third Omicron really isn't all that great, just because it's not bad. It's definitely nice to have on him, but he just doesn't need it. He gets healing immunity and buff immunity that aren't really that big of a deal. They can be, or they can't be resisted, but they can be dispelled. And then he just doesn't really need the damage. He will start knocking everyone's socks off once he gets going. Going back to Ben as well, I forgot we didn't really mention his third Omicron redeemed. It's, again, nice to have if you can afford it, but ultimately, Ben needs to be able to stack Mastery to be able to one-shot anyone under protection, which is really the only reason to have it, because there's really no point in you hitting under protection and Ray hitting over it if both of you have to hit the enemy to kill it. Next up, let's talk about Starkiller and Malicos here for a quick second. Now, Starkiller himself has a very important Omicron that's unique. It's why this character functions. We're not going to really go into it, but the Force Repulse and the Boundless Force Throw, they're definitely more on the luxury side, but they both can have real practical effects depending on the comp you're fighting. I found this particularly helpful fighting against the heavy buff Ray teams that use Swordy and JTR and Barris. Being able to dispel all of them at the same time is very nice. I've had it multiple times where I've been stuck behind a taunter like L3, and making sure that we not only dispel the taunt, but also crit immunity on Ray is crucial to therefore being able to remove the Inspired from her, because you have to be able to crit her to do that. So overall, it's pretty good. Balanced Force Throw is just nice ultimately to kill JTR if she was allowed to get Mastery during the battle, because otherwise you really won't be able to hit her. Although Force Repulse actually does a good job of that too, because this can't be evaded. So if you can get a big enough hit, you can actually just kind of squash JTR in there as well. Next up is going to be Malicos. His leadership is amazing. We don't really need to talk about it. Does a lot of cool things. The other two Omicrons, they're not super great. They do some fun things. The only real issue that I have with this Doubt one is that it goes from 2 enemies up to spreading to 2 enemies to spreading to all the enemies. So in 3v3, if you do the math, it doesn't really spread to anyone else. And even in 5v5, it's going to make its way around if they are actively cleansing it. This one gives some more turn meter. You get an extra, or the debuffs can't be resisted and some other stuff. I mean, it makes him a better character, but ultimately, you can kind of do fine just with the one, but they are helpful. And last but not least is going to be our good friends, Third Sister and Dr. Afram. This feels really weird because they're both in this final barely one category for completely different reasons. Reva's is because the character is so absolutely broken with her comp, she doesn't need the Omicron to be good. Yes, it does really help beating JMK, and there's a really weird counter I'm doing right now that involves SLKR to beat Leia and even punch up against Leia. That does require you to be able to get Deathmark on them to kill the enemies quickly because of how damage reduction is working right now. But that being said, Reva beats everything else without it, including other Galactic Legends. So yeah, you should apply the one. The other two aren't really all that important, but you can do things even if you don't. The same is very much true about Afra. The only difference here is Afra, the amount of teams that Afra can beat, it's significantly smaller and not as high as Caliber, but it's kind of a similar concept. She can do most of the things she can do without her GAC Omicron, albeit it does do some pretty fun stuff that is nice specifically for her kit, including adding in crit avoidance, some speed, and an extra potency, which is very nice given how most of her kit revolves entirely around potency. That is going to take up the 3 Omicron piece part of our of the video. Now moving on to the single Omicrons. How we're going to have this layered out is we're going to talk about the transformative, the really important ones that I think everybody needs, or at least people in the beginning and mid game, to be able to punch up against higher accounts. Then we're going to talk about the helpful ones that are typically good to have, but not entirely necessary to get that team to work. And the niche ones that really only work in very specific situations that most people don't even need to have in the first place. Transformative, we've gone over these characters a lot, so I won't spend a whole lot of time on it. Wampa, he turns into a one-man team. That's really where most of the value is here. Yes, he can beat some fairly decent teams, but ultimately, the reason you apply the Omicron on him is so you don't have to gear up 4 other characters in addition. He ends up beating some pretty good stuff like Mon Mothma and General Grievous. Qui-Gon Jinn's, I love it just because of how accessible it is. You get Qui-Gon Jinn, you throw on the Omicron, you give him Jedi Anakin, and they blow stuff up. Some people like to use him on defense. I primarily like to use him on offense just because the AI is really bad, and how Qui-Gon Jinn's Omicron lead works is if you are going after him right out the gate, you supercharge Jedi Anakin, and if you don't, you can't kill anyone at all. Next up is going to be Triad. Triad's Omicron is just amazing. It gives them a stupid amount of bonus protection per debuff, so you take it against any high debuff team, and they really just can't kill you. Even if they have locked healing immunity like Reva, it gives you a nice shell of protection to hide under, assuming you have a bunch of relics and stuff like that to boost your stats. Savage goes from being a pretty much worthless character before his Omicron, then once you give it to him, he becomes this incredible tank that constantly cleanses himself, and on top of that, gets extra speed, extra health, extra defense. constantly taunts and is just really hard to take down. A lot of people fail against Savage, not because he kills them, but purely because he times them out, because he's that hard and that tanky. Last but not least is going to be Aiden for the Transformatives here. Aiden has aged rather well, and I kind of always knew she would. With her GAC Omicron, the big thing about this is it all revolves around her team getting more max health, more max protection, and more turn meter every single time that an enemy attacks out of turn. Almost every single team in the game has a dedicated attack out of turn that this gets to build off of, and some teams are entirely attack out of turn. Similar to CLS, Mon Mothma, Geonosians. Even the Zori team has a tendency to do mass attacks every third turn or so that they just get to build so much off of. And then she gets to take out, again, that large spectrum of teams that you might not already have a counter for, like CLS, like Zori. Maybe not as much like Mon Mothma or Geos, but still, the answer still kind of remains there. So those were the most important that really transform their teams. They wouldn't be nearly as good without them. Now, next up, again, are going to be the helpful ones. These Omicrons, you don't necessarily need them for the team to function to some effect, but they do help and advance some counters depending on what you're wanting to kill. Asaja, I actually really like it. It gives her AoE ability the ability to reduce max health and defense, and then apply healing immunity, which ends up with this really nasty interaction with Plague. Marin's as well does something kind of fun. The first part of this actually isn't working properly yet. I don't know if this is going to be fixed because it'd be super broken where she gets 100% turn meter every single time someone is defeated or revived. This currently only works if she's the only living ally, but anyways, even with that being almost completely gone, at the start of Marin's turns, inflict enemies with 1 stack of Plague for 3 turns. That's really nice under a Mother Talzin lead, especially when you combine it with this one where Endless Wrath is applying healing immunity. You get to do those 2 things every single turn. They can't cleanse the healing immunity because they have Plague, and they can't heal the Plague because they have healing immunity. The team just essentially gets served a death sentence if they don't have something really broken to pull themselves out of it. Next up is going to be Zam. We used to rank Zam a lot higher, and the main reason why she's just not that high on the list anymore is because this isn't giving the team 70 speed isn't just a kill all anymore, and there are in fact other bounty hunters that are sometimes more useful, like Fennec, who are bringing an armor shred and maybe a faster contract to the table that can outpace her. She still is very good, but it's gonna vary on the counter you're wanting to pull off, whether or not you need her speed or you need the asset of another character in there. Adrad is also really nice. I personally love the amount of survivability that he gets by having his Omicron, because at the end of the day, Adrad's whole team dynamic is him surviving to the very end and getting his ultimate, nuking the enemy team, and calling it a day. It's really hard to pull off much before that. He gets 40% protection, and then also whenever Spark of Rebellion is dispelled, they get defense, health up, and protection up, as well as a lot of other offensive boosts that help the team survive so that he can get to his hope ability and just demolish the enemy team. Rex, I feel a little bit bad putting Rex in the helpful category because he is amazing. What he does for the Phoenix faction is probably the best thing a lifter-ish character has ever done for any team out there. The reason why he's kind of this low is just because the Omicron isn't why the team works. The team works because Rex is allowing everyone to assist constantly on a turn. He gets turn meter from debuffs. He gives out turn meter. He does a lot of that fun stuff, and he doesn't need the Omicron to do it. However, the Omicron is really good, especially if you're wanting to counter a team that is going to immediately put days out, and there are plenty of those that actually do it. Bad Batch is one that comes to mind immediately, and he gets to a bunch of speed and max health on top of it, so kind of a nice guarantee, especially if you're going in under Relict and you need 60% extra max health on top of it. So definitely good, but you're not going to need it for every single counter out there. Your Rex isn't worthless if he doesn't have the Omicron, is basically why he's here. And that takes up kind of the first section. By the way, these aren't like in any specific order. Helpful is helpful regardless. Next up is going to be Dash, and the reason why Dash isn't helpful and not any higher is purely because this is a one-trick pony Omicron. Basically what it allows him to do is Vandor never really loses prepared, so he constantly revives everyone. He can even do it multiple times per turn, which is pretty broken. Hondo's great. You put him on a Dash or any other team that has Scoundrels and he will go first. This really disrupts some specific counters like Bounty Hunters and Troopers that want to be able to go immediately out the gate. The problem why, again, he's not super high on the list is because you go from using a, I guess, cheapish counter like Troopers to beat it to doing another cheapish counter like Qui-Gon Jinn and or Night Sisters just to kind of get the same result, and the enemy Omicron really didn't have much effect at all. But it's still nice cutting out those counters. If you do that enough times across your board, that's ultimately how you can get more wins. First order TIE Pilot, I actually really like him. I realize a lot of people kind of looked at his stats, thought it was going to do something super amazing, transformative, and it kind of didn't, but it did allow the First Order to have a secondary team. And if you're not like at the very top of Kyber 1 or Kyber 2, you can still get a lot of use out of this. I frankly still get a little bit of use out of this, especially in 3v3, just with the foresight, the extra speed, and the extra max health that it gives to the team. It allows a secondary team under Hux or crew to still do some pretty fun things. This last 5v5, we actually beat an Afro team on defense with it. Hux stopped all the turn meter, and because I had all that bonus speed from starting with advantage, we just one-shot Afro right in the beginning. I don't think the enemy team got a single turn because our glass cannons were better than their glass cannons, specifically because of First Order TIE Pilot. Zora Blitz and Rose are going to be up next, and they're in a very similar situation that Rex is. The team is already amazing. You don't necessarily need the Omicrons to get there. Rose is going to add some nice turn meter, which can help close some gaps, especially if it gets turn meter loaded. That is a huge pain in the butt. Whereas Zori's, it just kind of guarantees that you're always going to have explosives out there, even if the enemy has really high tenacity or something like that. Or maybe if your enemy or opponent's trying to use Night Sisters, what will eventually happen is Doc will just build up a bunch of explosives, and you'll be able to one-shot her, even if you only attack her one time out of 50 when you're hitting zombie, because she's loaded up with all those things going on. So overall, they're good, but you're not going to need them for every match. And lastly, for the helpful, we have Seer, Junda, Tusken Raider, and Captain Drogon. Sears is pretty good. The reason why she's kind of falling this low on the list is just because it's not the same as Qui-Gon or Wampa or Iden, where you throw on the Omicron and you pretty much do nothing else and your team is already done. Seer needs a lot more investment on top of it. It doesn't really give you that much bang for your buck. Yes, it's good. Yes, I like having it. It's a staple of my defense. It takes very strong teams to beat, but it also requires a conquest character. It also requires that conquest character to have another Omicron. It requires other characters that I don't already have geared up, like Fulcrum, for literally no reason, to be able to add on a team. I had to steal crew away from First Order. And again, I love the team, but it's just not the exact huge picture of value for most accounts out there. So good, but you're going to need more than just that to get the team going. Next up is going to be Tusken Raider, and this one also feels bad putting him outside of the top tier, but it's entirely because it's only for 3v3. Yes, it does make specifically the Tusken Warrior and Chieftain comp very good and almost unbeatable by anything but gas and higher level counters. But again, it's 3v3, it's only one game mode, it's very specific, and you can't really use it outside of that. Drogon is here. This is actually a super hot take. I don't even have it yet. I've looked over it, and I actually just see a bunch of pros and cons at the same time, which typically, when you're looking at expensive upgrades, you don't want to see cons at all. But he has more health, which that seems kind of cool. And then at the same time, you're like, oh, then he can't get guard. And then he said that he constantly cleanses, and you're like, oh, that's cool. And then you remember that Reva applies Death Mark, kind of when that happens. So there's, yeah, it looks overall pretty good, but at the same time, I don't know if that's going to be the best bang for everyone's buck, and it might be lower. I don't think it would necessarily be higher, but it does some cool things, and I think overall does change the win rate. So I think ultimately that's what's most important. Theory is one thing, practice is completely another. Next up is going to be the niche category, where again, there are some cases where you can make these characters good, but overall you're not getting a whole lot of bang for your buck. Saw Gerrera, my actually biggest issue with Saw isn't even the Omicron itself. It's just fielding a Saw Gerrera team within itself is already a little bit difficult to do. He works with Rebel fighters, and most of them already work in better teams, and the ones that don't, most people don't have geared up. So you have to gear up the whole team from scratch. Kind of a similar idea to Seer, just the team isn't nearly as good as the Seer Unaligned Force user is. 000, I mean, he gets one extra turn of torture and some other stuff that really doesn't change the outcome of most battles, but could be nice in certain situations. Luminars, I really wish this was a little bit better. We've talked about how it does really poorly on defense, but even on offense, you're essentially just getting another cleanse for your team. I guess one of my bigger gripes with this is it does not work with Galactic Republic, specifically Padme, Jedi, Anakin. I mean, you can get it to work to some effect, but at the second they gain protection up, most of it just goes right out the window. It's okay. I have it. I kind of regret it, but it is what it is. Director Krennic, he has a very similar problem to Saw Gerrera, where this can do some fun things, but it requires you to use a team that you probably shouldn't be using in the first place, because it requires Death Trooper, and Death Trooper's doing way more important things over with Iden than he's with Krennic. Tusken Chieftain, unfortunately, is here for two reasons, and this is actually really sad, because he's Tusken Chieftain with the Omicron, and Dad Baba was actually a good team. The reason why he's all the way in the niche category is because, number one, the Tusken Raider Omicron is better against across the board as far as defensive viability goes. And then on top of that, it's also specifically for 3v3. So you're taking the lesser of two things that are already trapped into one specific type of game mode. So overall, not that great for him. Next up is going to be the second niche category. Chrysanthemum, I kind of regret this one too. It's not that good. It does help slightly mitigate the Afra counter, at least when, or even when Afra doesn't have her Datacron. The issue with that is, like, I've had my Jabba beat by Afra before, and I have the Omicron, and I guess I'm not going all in on tenacity to kind of make it all the much better, but it's not even a hard stop. Like, you're decreasing one singular counter by like 10%. I guess that's good, but it's just not, to me, it was not worth the Omicron price, which is pretty darn high. Chirpa just doesn't age well overall. The Ewoks are pretty good in the beginning of the game, even decent in the mid game. But even with Nisa running around, helping them punch a little bit higher, it's a lot of investment for not a whole lot of return for what you're able to do with them. You can be some high level stuff, but it takes a lot of really good mods. It takes a lot of relics that most people just wouldn't put on, and it doesn't really go well with a lot of good roster building. Dark Talon is actually one of the more confusing ones, I think, for a lot of people, because she is put on two really good teams, either Malicos or Traya, and does great things on both those teams. Her Omicron just doesn't add almost anything at all. What you're wanting from her on the team is the stat boosts, which are very nice, and then on top of that, she's giving turn meter to all of your allies whenever the leader is hit, which with Traya and Malicos happens constantly. Not really at all necessary, the Omicron, to be able to do those things. Snack Bar and Princess Leia, they're in kind of a similar situation where you're just not going to keep using them after a while. And the Omicron itself just doesn't have that much potency, or it's not that potent or powerful when it comes to Grand Arena. It will essentially evolve a turn meter loop. If you're up against an opponent who doesn't really know how to handle that, they can get caught in it. But if they do know what they're doing, it's really not that hard to get out of. And I've soloed, I think, the only one I saw with Nest, and that was the end of the game. And last and very much least, we have BT1, who is quite honest. The character is amazing. Omicron is hot garbage. We've talked about this before. He gets 30% turn meter and has his cooldowns refreshed whenever he or 000 defeats an enemy. He gets a bonus turn whenever he beats an enemy, and whenever he gets the bonus turn, he gets Haywire, which he can't use any other abilities. So your turn meter and your cooldown reductions are pointless because, anyways, yeah. Overall, great character. The Omicron just doesn't make any sense, and even if it did, it's only 3v3, so that would kind of knock it down a peg immediately. That is going to be it for today. Let me know what you guys think, and as always, stay awesome.